So we need to talk about a recent 9-0 unanimous decision that was issued by the Supreme Court involving the Fourth Amendment's protections and when excessive force by law enforcement impacts that right. The Fifth Circuit has now issued a new ruling potentially defying that decision by the Supreme Court, and because of that, this case has now made its way back in front of the Supreme Court once again. But now we have a major update coming out of the Supreme Court today. The Supreme Court has officially denied a re-review to this case. So let's talk about what happens and what it means for this case going forward. Now, before we jump into this video, if you want to support the channel, one of the best ways to do that is simply by subscribing. Also, I want to thank one of the main supporters of this channel, which is Attorneys on Retainer. When it comes to self-defense protection, in my opinion, AOR is in a league of their own. They're backed by an actual law firm, the Attorneys for Freedom, and they're always trying to give you as much as possible as a member. And right now, if you want to sign up using the links down below, if you use my code ARMSCHOLAR, they are running a special promo code where you can get $50 off of your individual sign-up fee or $25 off of your family plan. Now, as I mentioned in the intro, in this video, we're going to be discussing a recent 9-0 unanimous ruling issued by the Supreme Court. And this case involves the Fourth Amendment's protections against unreasonable searches and seizures and when law enforcement activities through excessive force impacts those rights. The unanimous ruling issued by the Supreme Court came in a case called Barnes versus Felix. And this case has already, been back in front of the Supreme Court for re-review just months after the court issued that initial ruling. That was because the Fifth Circuit issued a new decision in light of what the Supreme Court said in that 9-0 ruling. And the Fifth Circuit once again ruled that officers' actions are protected even under the totality of the circumstances approach. And the en banc panel decided to deny review to this case. The Fifth Circuit has engaged in some very interesting review of this case after the Supreme Court issued that ruling, which has now essentially led this case to go to the Supreme Court once again and was up for consideration last Friday. Now, the facts around this case are that the officer here, Officer Felix, pulled over Ashton Barnes for suspected toll violations. I believe there were toll violations connected potentially to a rental car, and Felix ordered Ashton Barnes to exit his vehicle. Barnes opened the door, acted as if he was going to exit the car, but then, making a horrible mistake, he decided to try to drive away and attempted to escape. Now, reacting in a split second, the officer then decided to jump onto the ledge of the car as it was driving away. And he decided, as the car was driving away, as he was on the vehicle, he pulled his firearm, fired 2 shots at Ashton Barnes, fatally wounding him. Now, in response to this incident, Barnes' mother sued the officer here essentially on behalf of her son, alleging that the officer violated Barnes' Fourth Amendment rights against excessive force. Now, on review, originally the district court granted summary judgment in favor of the police officer, applying the Fifth Circuit's moment of threat rule. The Court of Appeals affirmed, explaining that the moment of threat rule requires asking only whether an officer was in danger at the moment of the threat that resulted in his use of deadly force. So under that rule that was used, essentially events leading up to the shooting are not relevant and cannot be considered. Now, at that time, this case went to the Supreme Court for the first time, and the Supreme Court decided to grant review to the case and then issued a 9-0 unanimous ruling in favor of Ashton Barnes and his mother. Now, the Supreme Court held that a claim that a law enforcement officer used excessive force during a stop or arrest is analyzed under the Fourth Amendment, which requires that the force deployed be objectively reasonable from the perspective of a reasonable officer at the scene. The inquiry into the reasonableness of the police force requires analyzing the totality of the circumstances. That analysis, they state, demands careful attention to the facts and circumstances relating to the incident. So in this case, the Supreme Court rejected the more limited moment of threat analysis and instead applied the totality of the circumstances approach. The Supreme Court stated that most notable here, the totality of the circumstances inquiry has no time limit. While the situation at the precise time of the shooting will often matter the most, earlier facts and circumstances may bear on how a reasonable officer would have understood and responded to later ones. So the main thrust of that first ruling by the Supreme Court was rejecting the more limited scope of analysis applied with the whole moment of threat review. And instead, the Supreme Court ordered that the lower courts here need to look at the full picture before actually deciding this case. So they need to look at everything before and during the incident. Now, after the Supreme Court issued that 9-0 decision, the case was then sent back down to the Fifth Circuit to re-review and apply that correct totality of the circumstances approach and issue a new ruling. Now, interestingly, the panel in the Fifth Circuit did not hold oral arguments or ask for additional briefs in light of what the Supreme Court just said. Instead, they just issued a new ruling on their own. In the new ruling, the panel here in the Fifth Circuit held that even under the totality of the circumstances approach, the officer's actions were warranted. The panel reasoned that any vehicle flight, any flight at all, creates a deadly threat, and that the officer here reasonably used lethal force to prevent a dangerous chase. Because of that quick new decision without additional arguments or briefs, Barnes's attorneys and his mother then once again sought for Supreme Court review. They wanted a re-review of this issue. The petition argued that this new ruling by the Fifth Circuit contradicted what the Supreme Court just said in their prior decision. Now, here's the key development that just happened today in this case. After the case was distributed for conference last Friday, and after the government here waived the right to respond, so they didn't even file a response, the Supreme Court, after this conference on Friday on today's order list, issued an order denying review to this case. So they denied certiorari in this case. That means that the Supreme Court will not take up the Barnes versus Felix case once again. They're not going to re-review this or expand upon what they said prior. So what does that actually tell us with this case? Well, first, this is not necessarily a decision on the merits or anything like that. The Supreme Court is not saying that the Fifth Circuit necessarily got anything right. It's simply choosing not to step in and re-review this issue. Second, the Fifth Circuit's ruling now stands, and that means that the risk of flight reasoning used by the Fifth Circuit remains in place, at least within that circuit. And third, this kind of follows a pattern that we've been seeing happen quite frequently, which kind of happened recently with the Peterson suppressor case, where the court does not request a response from the government before the conference, and then soon after that, we get a denial in the case. So that's kind of showing a track record of if there's going to be a denial, usually this is how we're seeing this play out. Now, this denial has some important implications going forward. First, it leaves unresolved tension between what the Supreme Court said in that first 9-0 ruling and how the Fifth Circuit applied that ruling on remand and how they issued this new ruling. Still looking at the totality of the circumstances, but really justifying this situation based on the risk of flight rule. Second, it allows lower courts, at least for now, to continue developing how the totality of the circumstances test applies in these type of real world cases like this one that happened in the Barnes case. And third, it means that this issue may come back to the Supreme Court later, but likely in a different case, in a different factual pattern, based on maybe a different incident that happens. So this is where things stand now in the Barnes versus Felix case. We had that unanimous ruling issued prior by the Supreme Court, remanded to the Fifth Circuit. The Fifth Circuit issued their new ruling, essentially pushing back kind of against the rationale and using a different type of analysis or a different type of rationale, really looking at the risk of flight rather than really looking at this only through the lens of the totality of the circumstances. And now the Supreme Court has declined to step in on re-review in this case, which means for now, the Fifth Circuit's decision in this Barnes case will stand. So that's what is happening in this critical Fourth Amendment case. As more cases develop, as we get, maybe some ripple effects based on this ruling in the Fifth Circuit and the denial by the Supreme Court, I will keep you guys updated. But again, this is a very interesting case that can impact other types of situations going forward. So as we get more information, as it develops more, I will let you guys know. If you like this video and you'd like to support the channel, one of the best ways to do that is simply to like, comment, and subscribe. All of those things help to fuel the algorithm and just tells the algorithm that you appreciate this type of content, and so it shares it with more people. But as always, thank you so much for all of your support, and never forget this nation was built by armed scholars, and this nation will be maintained by armed scholars.